Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Casey Deline. I'm the curatorial assistant, registrar, and Louis B. Coleman associate for museum education here at Guildhall. We're beyond thrilled to be showing this amazing review of the work of Sid Solomon, and to have Mike Solomon here today to speak about it. I'd like to thank the Barry Campbell Gallery for their help with this exhibition, as well as the estate of Sid Solomon. Mike is an incredible artist in his own right, and I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about his background. He's exhibited widely throughout the United States at museums, galleries, and art fairs, and was recently included in an important exhibition, Art of Our Time, curated by Matthew McClendon at the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota, Florida. Additionally, he was included in Defining Abstraction, curated by Mark Ormond at the Ringling College of Art and Design, and he is preparing for an upcoming solo exhibition at the Greenville County Museum in South Carolina in February 2019. That's very exciting. He studied at the Skowhegan School of Sculpture and Painting in Maine, as well as the Yale Summer School of Music and Art in Norfolk, Connecticut. Spent the rest of time in New York City studying independently with noted artists such as Ray Parker and David Budd. In 1979, he earned his Bachelor's of Arts at the College of Creative Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. He studied with Charles Garabedian and John McCracken there. Additionally, he has served as a studio assistant for John Chamberlain, James Brooks, Charlotte Park, and Alfonso Osorio. In 1989, he earned his Master's of Fine Art at Hunter College in New York. So quite the resume. Thank you all for being here, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you all so much for coming. This has been such an incredible experience for me. Last night, the heart wave in the room was really palpable. I think people are discovering Sid for the first time. Some people know the work but haven't seen it in a while. But this new energy and, in a sense, the new view that we have of the work based upon research that we've been able to do in my parents' archives, which is newly organized, is still being organized, but newly organized, has revolutionized the way in which that we view Sid's work, what we understand about him as a man and as an artist. So in a sense, you can have something in front of you that you've known for a long time and really not know that much about it. That's kind of been the case. I mean, I thought I knew everything about my father until I discovered things in the archive, and it gave me a whole new view about what his work was about and how he operated as an artist. And luckily, Gail Levin, the esteemed art historian that wrote the main essay in this book, that's part of the show, that's in the bookshop, wrote an incredible essay based upon some of our research. So what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about some of Sid's background that's not really in the book or peripheral, and to give you a sense of him, and then to talk a little bit about some of the more sophisticated areas of his ideas and his thinking that normally not discussed. So I'm sure that it will be entertaining, if not interesting. The first thing to start off was that Sid's background was a very rough background. He was born near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1917, and it was a rough area. His people were struggling Jewish people who had to do lots of things to kind of get by. And he was a big boy. He was 13 pounds when he was born. And the area was Hungarians, which his parents were. They were both immigrants, Poles, Czech, people from Czechoslovakia. Those types of people had moved there for coal mining and all the rest of it. So it was a rough coal mining kind of area. He went to school in Wilkes-Barre and in Uniontown, which was not too far away, public schools. He became a football player and was on the varsity football team by the time he was 14 because of his size. He was kind of one of these people that had of these incredible opposites, because while he was a big, tough guy and quite tough and had to fight a lot to get by and to protect his younger brothers, he also had this really artistic side. He was very good at school. He was on the Glee Club. He studied lettering and he studied fine art. And the person that got him interested in fine art was a Native American woman who was his art teacher. And he would go out into the landscapes of Pennsylvania, up to the mountains nearby there, and do watercolors and things like that. So he had this really romantic streak and this very sort of gentle side. And then there was this real tough guy. He was a big man. He had huge hands. And so there's this sort of opposites that are in him that you'll start to see in all this work. Sort of a graceful quality and then a sort of a tough quality. So, you know, being Jewish and with World War II, you know, happening and all the rest of it, he enlisted in the Army in July, way before Pearl Harbor happened. And there was a man in Pennsylvania that knew about Sid's artwork, because Sid was even out of high school, was a well-known advertising artist, graphic artist, and someone who did lettering. So Homer St. Gaudens was the son of Augustus St. Gaudens, who was a very famous sculptor in America. And Homer St. Gaudens had run camouflage for the United States Army in World War I. And so when World War II broke out, the United States asked him again to be the guide to gather up people who could do camouflage, and Sid was one of the people that he recommended. And he was appointed to Fort Belvoir in Virginia and started training in camouflage, as well as basic training and all the other things that you had to have. It turned out, because of Sid's artistic background and the way that he thought about things, that he was not only a great designer of camouflage systems, but he was also a great promoter and educator on the use of camouflage. So he wrote a little pamphlet called Camo Tips, which was distributed throughout the Army to all the soldiers that were going off in the field, how to camouflage themselves using what was around them. And using very little skill, but finding out how to figure out how to camouflage themselves. Not only did he write the copy, but he did all the drawings, and he produced the whole booklet. And so when he had a couple of years here in the States before he was sent abroad, what he worked on, primarily the serious part of the camouflage, was how to hide troops and assets like trucks and tanks and things like that from aerial attack. He was an aerial camouflagist. And that figures in very heavily to the way that he became involved in the work that we're going to show you. And that was the connection that we made in studying what he actually did technically with camouflage and how he developed his paintings years later. He had to figure out how to cover trucks and tanks and troops, primarily for the Normandy invasion. He was there on D2. And as you may know, once we broke through the line, there were no supplies. We broke through quite fast. And then nobody had planned on breaking through that fast, so there were no supplies. So there were all these troops with no ammunition, no food, no nothing. And so they had to fly planes into these little airstrips in who knows where, just find a place where a plane could land and get it there. So the airplanes that flew in with the supplies would be seen by the German bombers. So you had to disguise airplanes. So they made like these fake trees that they would roll around an airplane, and the leaves would cover the wings and all this stuff. So this was the kind of stuff that he did. And this orientation of looking down at things and having to cover them and having this vertical column of layering was something that really stuck in him, because this was a crucial thing. This was a question of the war effort and men's lives and all the rest of it. So it wasn't a simple job. It was quite emotionally fraught with pressure. So I believe that kind of ingrained in him, and it became later on it became the technique for his work. So I'm going to walk around now over here and start talking about how that became part of the work. So this painting, Marquee, which was done in 1947, when he and my mother had settled in Sarasota, Florida. He had frostbite in the early days, really before technically the Battle of the Bulge, but just a few weeks before they were up in Belgium, and he and his men got pinned down in a house in which it was an abandoned house, and the Germans had pinned them down, and it was exceedingly cold, and the army had issued suede boots to everybody. And these boots, Sid said, they soaked up water from a puddle 5 feet away. So everybody got frostbite. And so when he got out of the war, the doctor said, if you want to be comfortable, you really can't live in any cold climates. You're just going to be in pain all the time. And that's why they didn't move to New York City and join the other artists. So he kind of missed his moment, because not only by being in the war, but by after the war, he couldn't really live in the city. So they moved to Florida, first to Miami, and then they went over to Sarasota. So this was done in Sarasota. It's called Marquee, and a marquee in England is not a sign on a thing, it's a tent that you get under, and they have events. And you can see these structures with figures underneath it, these structures were a lot like the drawings of some of his camouflage tents that he would build that they would hide things under. So he's taking something directly from his experience in designing camouflage and using it as a structure for a much more romantic and nice experiences, which is, I suppose, going to the theater or something like that, or some kind of grouping. But this structure here is very similar to some of the camouflage structures that he used. That's sort of the first sort of a literal interpretation of kind of how the camouflage came to be. But we'll get into more esoteric ways. This painting, I'm not going to go through every painting, but I just want to talk about a few significant ones. This one and several others that are not in the show, but that exist, were done from an underwater experience. He had a friend that had diving bells, and they went down to Bimini and went diving. And when he saw how everything looked underwater, he was fascinated by it. And he did about maybe 4 or 5 paintings about this size or larger of what things look like underwater. And so what we see is that his orientations are all starting to be unique in a sense. It's not like being in a room and looking at a still life or looking at something in the space that we normally occupy. He's taking his reference from looking down at the earth. There are several paintings that look a lot like his aerial photographic shots that they had to take when they were surveying places to do camouflage. We don't have any of those in this show, but they exist. And then these paintings from what it looks like underwater. So there's this kind of different orientation to the way things look. This painting down here at the end, well, both of these, but this one in particular, which was a favorite of his, he talked about the idea of a window, which is an old motif. Matisse and Picasso, and I mean, it goes way back, of course, in art, the idea of a hole or a window. But for Sid, again, it was this idea of layers, and have one thing is a reality underneath another thing that's a reality, and there are these little windows where you get to see down through it. This was, again, this aerial point of view that he was looking down at things. He had actually designed tents for artillery guns that would hide the gun, and then they'd be pulled open and the gun would shoot a plane down and they would slide up again. They would be covered with foliage or something like that. So this idea, particularly of this little window here, began to be a very strong motif in the work. And that led to almost everything else in the show is kind of based on this idea. All the other paintings, let's move around a little bit. So I'm going to talk about these techniques first, and then I'm going to talk about some of the more, because everybody's really interested in this technical side of Sid's work. And so I want to sort of talk about it to explain it, and then we can move on to some other aspects that are deeper. The idea of this window, idea or the breakthrough from one space into another really fascinated him. And in the late 40s, he started experimenting with spraying color onto paintings. At first, they were very small little watercolors, and he would use what they call an oral atomizer, which is just two little pipes that stick together, and you stick one into ink or watercolor, and you blow on the other one, and it sprays. It's like a manual sprayer. They still exist today. I use one on almost all my work right now. Eventually, he took to using spray cans. Spraying of paint goes back to France in I think Man Ray or somebody like that used the first sprayers of paint. But the spray can, as we know it in America, didn't really come about till the 50s, and Sid started using them as soon as he sort of figured out that he wanted to work large. The little atomizer wasn't going to cover enough ground. And he had worked with other techniques that had to do with making layers, one of which was the wax resist technique, which is something that Victor Bronner, but who you may know of, but who you definitely know of, is Alfonso Osorio. Alfonso Osorio made a lot of wax resist paintings from 49 through, well, the rest of his life, but in 50 and 51, his wax resist paintings were incredible. And as some of you may know, my family lived on the property of Osorio in 1959, and there were some of the wax resist paintings in the little cottage that we rented. Sid was doing it before he saw Alfonso's work, but it's an interesting connection between the two artists, that they had this idea of being able to save something with a material and paint over it and then wash it away, and the underneath layer would be saved. What Sid devised in inculcating the methods and the scale of abstract expressionism, because he was late to the party and because he had this different pathway in terms of where he lived, while he considered himself part of the movement and part of abstract expressionism, that was sort of the voice or the mode of his time, his adaptation to it is an incredibly unique and individual one. He does not have the palette, obviously, of the urban palette of the 50s that the New York artists had. He doesn't have, although he painted a little bit like that for maybe a year or two, and the impasto that was in all those paintings, he had that for a little bit, but as soon as he kind of figured his own real voice out, he quickly moved to this kind of painting, which is extremely flat, very thin, not the colors of the city, but the colors of nature. And he lived out here, my parents lived out here from 59 onward, and also in Sarasota back and forth. And so the palette is exceedingly different from that of the urban environment. The technique which he developed was to create these, basically prime a canvas with several big colors, and then to use this masking agent, which he could use gesturally. It wasn't like cutting a stencil out that had to be hard edge or something like that. Of course, we're all talking about everything pre-Photoshop and pre-laser cutting and pre-all that. So now you can do anything with anything, but then that kind of stuff was very difficult. He loved Pollock's work and he loved the gesture. He wanted to make that a big part of him. He had training in lettering and in all of the graphic design elements, but particularly in lettering. And so the idea of the brushstroke having a meaning and the idea of energy coming from it was something that he was really involved with. So he would use the masking agents to, in a sense, give that gesture. But a masking agent isn't a positive mark. It's a negative. It's not even a negative. It's something that's hiding something else. So when you look at these things, if these white marks were paint, you would think, oh, that's like Jackson Pollock, but they're really hiding the white that was underneath them from the blue that was sprayed on after them. And they go up into this area that was painted black and blue, and so they save the black. So this is one mark that's covering two different areas that are painted in two different ways. And so when you read it, you can't really figure that out. And that was what he loved. He loved the fact that it was sort of a mystery and that there was this non sequitur, in a sense, between these two areas that you couldn't quite figure out. Technically, it's really an incredible feat, in a way, that he could learn to see like that. In some ways, it's like printmaking, where you're always working in the opposite. You have to see the opposite of what you're going to print. And so he didn't do this as just one operation. This would be done on several operations on a painting. So it really becomes obscured because it's not just being done one time. It's being done once and then, okay, I'll do some more. No, I'll paint that out and do it again. And so they get very complex very quickly. I don't know if I've explained it that clearly, but basically it is that operation of painting some kind of colored ground, throwing the masking agent on it, usually as a big gesture, and then spraying paint. This blue is spray paint, and you can see that it was sprayed on top of the black here, and on top of the white here, and on top of the red here, which turns the red purple. So that's all just one operation of spraying blue on some of these areas too, on top of the masking. And then he would take a garden hose and spray the stuff off. So he has this great joke. There's a wonderful movie, not this movie, but there's another movie called Sid Solomon, the Man, the Artist, that Linda Tessa, who's here somewhere, made. There she is. And they filmed Sid painting and some of his buddies talking about him. And one of Sid's lines is he's out with the hose, and he says, people see me out here in Sagaponack with the hose, they think I'm watering my paintings. It's not a very good joke, but anyway. So that's kind of the basic idea behind the technique. What we don't really get to in those kinds of things are more his philosophical point of view. And that is something, let's turn to the back here. You know, Sid was very good friends with Harold Rosenberg and Tom Hess. They were pretty much his two best buddies in the art world. Harold liked the work a lot. Unfortunately, he never really wrote about it, but they had a long dialogue about it. And Sid was also quite friendly with Clem Greenberg. I found a photograph in our archives of Clem down in Sarasota in 1961. I was like, that's Clem Greenberg, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, so, but he didn't, what Sid didn't do, maybe because he was already an outsider and there was really no reason to try to get inside, or maybe it was because he was always an outsider anyways, was he really didn't buy into any particular camp. He didn't want to be located or locked into color field painting or into abstract expressionism or into anything. And this is sort of what he says about it. He said, it is necessary for me to be capable and sufficiently aware to react to my own past and to the total past on my own terms. I cannot uncover the essence of art by logic, a logic that would compute the answers to the next step for me. And that's certainly a reaction against Greenbergian methodology in terms of painting. So this was a person that had a very independent point of view about what his work was about. And I want to look at this painting for a minute. This painting is owned by Guildhall, Trip East, and I think although all the paintings have the complexity, this painting really has a very complex point of view. And I want to read you one other thing that Sid talked about. Where is it? And this is from the French painter Jean Dubuffet. who was a brilliant writer about art. Dubuffet says, from the onset, every work of painting is based on equivocation. The painter actually assigns himself two very different roles. On the one hand, he seeks to be an interpreter, a medium of the objects he evokes, to grant them speech, to make himself their voice. But at the same time, he wants to make his own voice heard, which is something entirely different. The mechanism of the two meanings, which might be said to be contrary, that of reception and that of emission, conjugated in a single operation, a single wire conducting two contrary currents, this mechanism invariably functions somehow in every painter. It is what gives the art of painting its density. And I think that that perfectly sums up the deeper philosophical point of view that Sid had. He had developed this incredible and original technique, which was, I think, a requirement of artists of his generation. They had to really be original. You know, if somebody used a squeegee, nobody else could use a squeegee. That's the squeegee guy. If somebody threw paint on the canvas, then you were copying him. Nobody wanted to, now everybody wants to copy everybody. Then you couldn't copy anything. So you had to have an original way that you went about it. So he obviously figured that out. And he had this technical prowess. He was experimenting with what they called polymer temperers, which was the precursor to acrylic paint. There was a chemist down in Sarasota that he knew that would give him this stuff to use, and that stuff became acrylic paint. So Sid was an early experimenter with acrylics, and he had a lot of different technical abilities. But technical ability is just technical ability. You know, these are the skill sets of our trade, but they're not what make painting great. What I think gives painting its density, what gives it a long-lasting feeling, something that we admire not just when we first see it, but maybe we admire it over a 20-year period. We keep looking at a painting and it keeps revealing itself like a great symphony or something, is this complexity that Sid talks about having. That while he had all these ways and technical ways of looking at art and these different orientations of approaching the canvas, his other side, the romantic side, the notions of nature mixing with his own personal nature are really much more what the work is about than, if you really want to say what's the work about, it's really about this mixture between external nature and internal nature. And I think this painting perfectly demonstrates that. I mean, we can see a window, sort of maybe a literal window up there or some kind of light area. There are these forces that seem a lot like nature. The colors seem a lot like nature, but at the same time, they're very emotional and personal. And this is a quote when he's talking about presumably he's talking about external storms, which he loved to be in the house that they had on the beach in Florida. And we rode out 2 or 3 hurricanes in the house. So he kind of loved that. It was kind of like watching this all happen, and water would flow through the house. And but it was also talking about something else. I prefer the first insane ebullience. The first dramatic sweeps are insane speculations of nature in the act of creation, the insanity of life-filling forms bursting with the punch of natural phenomena, the insanity of the storm. I don't really think he's talking about simply the external storm. I think that he's talking about all the forces and all the passions and all the rest of it that he certainly had as generating what the work of art was. And in terms of this idea of being non-systemic in his work, while he had certain techniques that he brought to bear on the paintings, he was always doing something to break what he already knew. He never approached a canvas the same way. Each canvas, he would throw a curve at it and then try to work himself out of that curve. One of the devices that he used was this division of canvases. There are a lot of diptychs and triptychs in his oeuvre. This is the one that we have here in the show. He would paint these in terms of priming, like I was talking about. Each panel would be painted a different color. So this one, I think, was, I don't know if it was red, I think that's sprayed, but I think this one was brown. This one was black. These black marks are the original prime that were on the canvas, and then the masking came, and then this is all spray paint that goes around it. And this one was kind of this mauve color. So it's starting with this problem of a canvas that is divided physically even by 3 colors, and then trying to unite them and bring them together. So that's one of the devices that he would use to struggle through. And this idea of always having a struggle, always having some kind of challenge, I mean, that's really what a long-term painting process is really about. I mean, you get really good at something and you start repeating yourself, and then it goes dead. I mean, that doesn't mean that people wouldn't buy it. It just means it's dead for you. And he was really, really adamant about continuing to challenge himself. Let's move down a little bit. Yeah.
I worked for Sid for 15 years as a studio assistant. You were talking about how long...
Larry.
Yeah, Larry.
Holy shit, I didn't even recognize you. Why didn't you introduce yourself? God damn it, man, what's wrong?
But I want to say something to you. This is a magnificent painting. I think Mike's absolutely right, and the museum is awful lucky to have this piece. It represents everything Sid ever did. He did do a lot of diptychs and triptychs. If I may say so, just from a practical standpoint, triptychs and diptychs gave us an opportunity to work larger, right? Because canvases have a limited size. So there was a practical side to Sid too. Economy and how can I make the canvas larger? You were saying how long it took Sid to do paintings, spraying and building up the canvas. This painting took almost 2 years.
Well, you know what his real answer was to that question. When you see you're misleading them.
Right.
Everybody would ask him, how long does it take to do a painting? All my life.
Right.
Let's move down. Again, what he's doing is challenging himself. And so these paintings that are pretty much, this one's done on a black background entirely. But there are these areas that he left free so that he could, painted the red and the brown square. And I remember watching the base coat of this being made, where it was mostly black, except for these marks here and these two. And then he's starting to bring in the spraying and the masking to develop these areas. But I love these 2 paintings because they have this geometry in them. And you go into the studio and he'd have like Art in America spread out with Frank Stella's and stuff like that. And that painting, which you can look at after we talk, those bands, that's a protractor painting right there from Stella that he ripped off and put it in his painting. So he's always challenging himself by putting in elements that exist in art or that exist in nature, and doing something that he hasn't done before. There's always the natural background, the natural world in the work. It comes from just that he was always immersed in nature. He worked outside primarily, not inside. He had sort of these inside-outside studios, but as the video shows him working outside, he worked outside a lot. That studio in Sagaponack was very close to the beach. The one in Florida was on the beach, and so he was working in the elements that he really got his energy from, the sea and the sky and all that. But this is not to say that he's really a nature painter. That's just the sort of one of the levels, one of the areas that he's taking from and mixing it with all these other concerns that have to do with formalism, they have to do with painting processes, they have to do with the canonical ideas of large painting that came from abstract expressionism. So it's a mixture of a lot of stuff. And so, he talks a lot about the complexity of his work. And that's really pretty much all I have to say. I think the rest of it is just looking at the work and kind of trying to see it through these lenses. But I'd take any questions, comments.
I see, from my point of view, most of these are camouflage, and it goes back to his time when he
Yeah,
was in the army.
yeah.
And did he suffer from PTSD, or
Hmm?
did he suffer from post-traumatic stress?
Yeah, he did. He absolutely did. When he got out of the Army, which was November of 45, so he was in from July of 41 to November of 45, okay? And he had seen some serious battle. He had, he'd also had some fun, but doing the camouflage and all that. But they went to Miami. He had a friend from Pennsylvania that gave him a job, and the jobs were very scarce for these guys coming back from jobs in housing were very scarce after World War I. So he had a job in Miami. Miami was kind of the place where people young men had hung out who didn't go into the war. They just didn't have to. And he would start beating people up. And it got really bad. He was not happy, obviously, in that context. And so the authorities asked him to leave Miami. They said, if you beat one more person up, you're going to spend 1946 in jail. He never told my mother this story, but he told me and my sister the story several times. My mother's still in denial about it, but that's why they drove over to Sarasota. And they got to Sarasota, and here was like the Ringling Museum in this sleepy little fishing town. They were like, wow, this is awesome, let's stay here. And the rest is sort of history. But, when he was a younger man in Pennsylvania, he had to fight a lot to not, he had to fight a lot. It was a very rough area. And then he became sort of an amateur boxer, and he sparred with a boxer named Fritzy Zivik. And most people who know boxing know about Fritzy Zivik. He was known as the dirtiest fighter in the world. And my father learned all of his tricks. And so when Bud Schulberg, the screenplay writer and writer, who was a great friend of his, wrote about Sid, he said he's one of the most dangerous men that walk the earth. And so a guy like that with PTSD was pretty dangerous. By the time I was born, it was pretty much gone, And but I'll tell one story, and that is very late, when Sid was going into his Alzheimer's in about 1990, we were standing around outside on the deck near his studio, and I made some derogatory crack about him to my friends, showing off, being an asshole that I am. Anyway, so he used to carry these little buck knives. They were like in his pocket, about like that big when it's opened. And before I could say anything, and this is a guy that's sort of tottering around and not being able to do much, and he whips this knife out of his pocket, and without looking, he goes like that, and it sticks in the wall about 8 feet away, and I can't pull the knife out of the wood. It's like that far into the wood. And he was like at the end of his life, practically. So I was like, oh my God, he really does have dirty tricks. I'm glad I never got to experience them. So he had that kind of real tough, dangerous quality to him. And I think that that generation of men did have that. The drinking I think that a lot of the drinking was actually to soften it. They didn't really know how to make that transition from one state into the other. And certainly going into the art world was that you had to make that transition. Or even making a painting in a way, you had to make that transition. You don't see that today, but that was a pretty much a across the board kind of sensibility. It's not that we forgive it or don't forgive it. It's just that's how it was. That's all. So.
Was this his first time to show at Guildhall, or how many times?
Sid was in 13 shows at Guildhall. From 1963 on, he was in, and there was one other survey show like this, which we have photographs in the archive. Yeah, so.
He must have had to also defend himself from anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. But the really interesting thing is, I mean, he pretty much left Judaism after he had his bar mitzvah. I mean, he didn't want to have anything to do with it. I was not raised knowing anything about, I mean, we celebrated Christmas. I had to beg to go to temple in 3rd grade when I realized I was Jewish, and I had to realize that I was from a Jewish family and asked to go. And they took me for about 2 weeks, and it was like, nah, we're not schlepping you out there. You're just, so there was no religious part of it. I mean, he certainly considered himself Jewish and had a private relationship with spirituality. I mean, I think that art making is an absolutely spiritual practice. You're dealing with the universe and yourself in it and all that. It's a spiritual thing. But I think he was a modernist too, so, he didn't go down that road. And, but, didn't change the name, and we lived in the South, and there were plenty of people that, were around, but he really wasn't afraid of it or anything. He was very political in the early years. He did a lot of work for campaigns for people in the White House and stuff like that, the Truman campaign and all kinds of things like that, yeah.
Are any of these for sale?
Yes. Talk to her. They're both there. The 2 angels, Christine and Martha, Barry Campbell Barry, they are the best. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you.